Welcome to AlertFind's webinar, Emergency Preparedness Training, Creating Customized Scenarios for Your Organization. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to use the chat feature to ask any questions that you have, and any that we don't get to, we'll round up and turn into a blog post on alertfind.com. And a recording of today's webinar will be emailed out to all of you after we finish. And you can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #EPTrainingSuccess. I am so pleased to introduce to you all today Glenn Jones. He's an emergency preparedness expert and strategic customer success manager at Resolink. Glenn Jones is an experienced business continuity and emergency preparedness leader, leveraging technology to improve business operations. As part of his business continuity work, he's created customized emergency preparedness training scenarios at locations around the world. And my name is Danielle Ricci. I'm the marketing team leader for AlertFind. AlertFind is an emergency notification system that businesses, hospitals, and schools can use to send out multi-channel alerts to employees and students in the event of an active shooter, natural disaster, or other emergency. Welcome, Glenn. We're so pleased to have you today.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And today we're going to cover with Glenn how to identify the unique risks that each of your locations faces, to rank those risks to identify your top areas to focus on, and create scenarios tailored to the exact risks that your organization faces. So let's start with identifying risks. What's the best way for organizations to start identifying risks? And how does having multiple locations in different states or countries affect risk assessment?
Okay, so to start, I'm going to go with a process that we've used for a global organization, understanding that when you're working within a global arena and you've got multiple customers, there are a number of items that are very consistent within your industry. Obviously, establishing a platform at which you build upon is probably one of the most important pieces to start with. And 22301 is the standard used for business continuity, but there are other elements that we have to consider, like some of the requirements for assessing risk for 9001, 2015 version, number of customer requirements that we'll end up seeing, and then just understanding your overall business, because at the end of the day, our focus as business practitioners or risk practitioners is really ensuring that we maintain a good reputation for our organization. If you could go to the next slide, I'm going to walk through a couple of steps that we've used in other organizations as a general risk assessment process, because the key thing that we have to get to is beyond creating documentations and having discussions about risk, and what to some will look like fear mongering and things of that nature. It really comes down to putting it into a way that is beneficial to the company. You have to get it into a situation where we are really supporting the company. So we're going to go through a very, what I would say is an easy 5-step process. But again, remember, this is more of a process that's used within an organization, scaling back a lot of the technical details that are involved. So one of the main things we look at is we try to determine stakeholders and what our requirements are. That can come in a number of ways. My process was looking at it from our customers, where we actually do business at, and then we start to look at a number of things, depending on the size of the strategic or customer and such. Some of the key things will come down to identifying how much revenue do they generate within our organization. What are some of the parts and components that we provide for that supplier or customer? Where are we actually providing their parts out of? And then also, are there dependencies on other facilities that we use within our own internal network? So that's really trying to understand who your overall stakeholders are. It's going to come down to your customers, industry standards, and aligning this with really your executive team. This is the very first part where you'll start looking at how can I structure a program that's going to help the organization and ultimately start getting buy-in. This is actually one of the first steps in doing it. The next piece that we start looking at are the outlining of all of our categories and our risks. I'm going to cover that in another slide, but this looks at all of the different risk categories and the various indicators that are in there. I think the first thing that we were looking at within one of my organizations is the tsunami of 2011, which was probably one of the most impactful um, disasters because, again, it's a natural disaster, very broad reaching, but it began to give you visibility in different um, aspects of your business. And then over the past year, you've had a number of things that impact supply chains for a company, from Hanjin, a global logistics provider, going bankrupt, and a number of um, suppliers doing ERP solution upgrades and things of that nature that limit their ability to fulfill orders. There's so many other variables that we have to consider. And then we go into the area where I say it's identifying the CBOs. And the CBOs are your critical business operation areas. These are, if you look at your business as a whole and you look at each individual location, if you have multiple facilities, these are the things that are needed in order to fulfill orders, requests, that are going to your customers. I tend to look at it from an order to cash type perspective. So it is looking at when the request comes in, when we've made a commitment to deliver, are we able to continue to provide the product and or service according to our SLAs, and then what are some of the ways this can impact it. And then this starts to tie into your supply chain. And when you start looking at your supply chain, like I think a lot of companies would look at the cost associated with a given CBO. If I have and I'll use manufacturing because that's industry I come out of. If I look at an automated assembly solution, I may tie it to a single customer, and I would consider that to be my high risk CBO. But the reality is, I could have a number of other assembly processes that use high volume, low cost supply. And I may not realize it, that they're coming from the same single source provider. And for that reason, I've now exposed the risk that's actually greater than the one high volume or high cost customer that I have. So it's really looking at how a lot of this information comes together. And then now that you've started to identify this, you're going to go through your risk assessment. And collectively, this thing doesn't happen at a single site. I mean, we had previous organizations, between 54 and then after an acquisition, about another 72 facilities that we had to consider, and every location becomes its own assessment, because when we have to respond to customers, or if we're looking at who our stakeholders are, that's where our issues are going to rely on. Next slide, please.
Oops.
Now, seems a little overwhelming because, from a presentation perspective, yes, it's a lot of words. But when you consider um, all of the different areas that we have to look at across our organization, these are just a number of some of the potential risk categories that we would have to look at, from business continuity, which is an area where I'm definitely seeing a major increase of requirements that are being driven by customers around the world. We have compliance, which it's going to definitely drive a lot of your legal aspects of the organization, and these are really important because, again, it's maintaining information protection of data. Good example is if you look at lawsuits between Apple and Samsung years back. Some of the information leakage issues don't happen after production. It's usually during the production area, and that's where a lot of protection requirements are needed. Now you have cybersecurity and a bunch of other areas that are definitely becoming more prevalent within the business area, whether you're in finance, in recruiting, manufacturing, whatever. If you name the organization, these are things that are definitely becoming more important within our business landscape today. Then you've got delivery. They can be impacted by a lot of things, from your acquisitions to um, the breakdowns in their carriers and the forwarders and things of that nature. You've got market conditions, which, um, past years we saw a lot of companies. I mean, as a matter of fact, within the last quarter, there's been a ton of force majeure due to financial constraints on a number of organizations within the manufacturing area that I saw firsthand. Then you've got quality. If we look at, again, I'm going to go back to like manufacturing area. Last year alone, there are a number of suppliers like Kobe Steel, um, Sabic, and a bunch of other companies that basically, well, like in the case of Kobe Steel, it's a Japanese metal company, and they basically went public and explained to their customers that they had been lying about the quality of the products that they provided. This went to the news immediately, which then immediately creates a bunch of inquiries for your business continuity teams and your procurement teams to understand how does this impact the products that I purchase from you. And this is another area where we have to make sure it may not be directly within our organizations, but again, if you consider your supply chain, that's a key piece of your order to cash type of a structure. And the last category is your social responsibility. This is looking at the fact we are a global organization. There are a number of things that we look at from the companies that actually provide service within our facilities. We would evaluate them with our users at the different plants when we were building risk assessments, and often questioned about this one. But you've got simple things like your cleaning crews, understanding do they maintain excessive work hours for their employees. The trucking industry is one that's always looked at, because if you have drivers that are driving beyond their hours, you've got union issues. You also have the possibility of people being injured just to pure exhaustion. That also puts a very bad look on your organization. So these are definitely risks that we do. And obviously, if you get into a situation where the exposure of a breach or an issue of any of these situations happen, that then gives a black eye to your organization, which ultimately um, sends customers to potentially sue competitors. Next slide. Okay, so because of the focus on risk, again, a lot of what we do is we're going to look at our own facilities. Obviously, our own facilities are then impacted by suppliers. And one of the things that we started looking at within my last organization was expanding, just instead of just looking at our own facilities, let's look at everything that can directly impact our ability to service customers. And that's where looking at a number of areas within your supply chain became really important. Um, and so that's understanding, do they have a business continuity process similar to what we're required to have by our customers? And now that we've established a program, can we now drive a lot of those requirements to them? Simple things like the emergency response. If there's a fire or something in a facility, do you have the process to protect your employees first and to ensure the resilience of your organization? Dealing with crises, and now that you've got the transportation recovery, do you have alternate paths? Again, I brought up um, transportation because, again, logistics is a key piece to global business, and making sure that um, your corridors and you have other alternatives. You can't put all your eggs in one basket, literally, or a container. Um, Next phase of it is again, we're going down safety, IT recovery. You can also include information security, which is another area that's not on this particular slide, but I realized we were going to have too much content on slides. But it's really putting together the plans and understanding what your suppliers are having. And then the last piece of it is supplier BCP, and that's you first having redundant suppliers that you can have fail over if needed. And then it's also them having their actual plans in place that they actually test and they're familiar with, and that their leadership team can facilitate as needed. Next slide.
Great. And can you tell me more about the scoring system that you use?
Okay, so the scoring system that we use, it looks at a couple of things. It basically puts together a likelihood and impact for every risk that we identify. And so if you think about those risk categories, there was a risk outlined for each of the categories that were identified. So it was a very long process. And I think at one point, because we were trying to cover all of the different requirements from ISO standards, BC, from 22301, 9001, social responsibility requirements from different customers and things of that nature, and our own compliance requirements, we put weights to them. They were subjective based on things that were most important to us. So what aligned most with our business objectives? And again, this is going back to that area of tying this to your leadership so that you can make sure you get buy-in. And you'll keep hearing me repeat different elements that are going to tie it into the organization because, again, buy-in is important. But once you can identify it, then you can then put it's a basic equation that multiplies the weight times the impact times the likelihood, and that gives us the risk priority number. From there, we're able to then rank each of our risks so we can identify which risks are higher based on each facility. From there, we were able to group them, consolidate them, and group them, and then we can understand where our greatest risk exposures were around the world. And we were broken down by division. So again, the key pieces by division, how that impacts customers and things of that nature. Rating is very simple. We use a basic count of 3 for high, 2 for medium, and 1 for low, and a 0 for not applicable. But you can have your own discussions, and again, that becomes something that's more subjective within your organization of how you consider ratings. I mean, obviously, we use weight via our accelerator, but you can also use different numbers for your rate for your low, medium, and high impact and or likelihood.
Great. And so now that you've taken us through the risk assessment process, how do we translate this into training? This is where people tend to really struggle.
It all comes down to the risk, right? At the end of the day, you don't. It's understanding what risks are most applicable to each location. So, like within a corporate facility in manufacturing, there's not much manufacturing that happens typically where your back end office, your finance, IT groups are, and things of that nature. In that case, you're working closely with your EH&S, your employee health and safety group, ensuring that you have the proper exit strategies established so that if there is a tornado, fire, um, hurricane, depending on where you are, what kind of natural disasters, or like in the case of Chicago area where I'm from, you've got snow. If the facility gets shut down because of the massive amount of snow that we had, it's making sure that you have the right communication protocols and things of that nature. But then when you start to look at the next phase of it, you have plants that are around the world. If you have areas that are like Taiwan and Japan, where you know that you're going to have a higher number of natural disasters, then you also have supply chain issues. It's really trying to understand the leadership teams that you have within those facilities, understanding what their strengths and weaknesses are, and then developing the training based on that.
Great. And I am really excited to talk to you about the real world training scenarios. I know that you have some anecdotes about a couple of natural disaster or, disasters at work sites that have, happened recently.
Yeah, this part actually is the fun part, right? Because you think about all the happening, right? So I
You have
look
a
at
fun definition of fun, Glenn. Yeah.
well, when traveling and going to all the different facilities, sometimes parts of the discussions are kind of boring. I'll be honest, right? But when it gets to getting people to think out of their comfort zone and to look at the other aspects of the issue, this is where I find it kind of exciting. So, Hurricane Harvey, major issue within a lot of organizations. I was lucky that it didn't directly impact my companies that I was a part of, but I worked with other companies that did. And some of the things that they kind of blew off, again, it was in their supply chain. They was like, well, we don't have facilities there, but they did actually because some of their key suppliers are in those areas. I mean, these are some of the things we have to consider. But you also have to kind of talk through what do we do in a situation if we didn't predict it well enough? And I can use a number of examples. Like I remember a hurricane went through Zhuhai, China, and that's an area that hadn't had a real storm in 54 years. In their mind, it's never happened here. But the reality is, we still need to train on it because it's it's always a possibility. They were lucky. Most storms typically hit a tip of mainland China or Hong Kong, or was slowed down by Taiwan before it got into their canal. But this time last year, they actually got hit direct, and so you have to deal with those types of scenarios. Other ones that you have to answer for is, I mean, think of just last year, California and the forest fires. That was one that directly impacted us. Um, and it's really just looking at these, even though they're events that in some places you have to kind of identify which places have a higher probability to be impacted by it. And we would typically determine our probability of a disaster based on history being our greatest predictor. If it didn't happen within 3 years, we gave it a low probability. If it happened within 3 years, it was a medium. And if it was within a year, then it was a high. So think of all of the plants and facilities, offices, banks that you have within California right now. You're reassessing your risk because, surprise, we just went through a bunch of forest fires and mountain fires at the same time.
And I know that you've cooked up a real world scenario for us to talk through, and I'm excited to get to that. Do you want to go through the overview and the process of doing this scenario-based training?
Absolutely. So when we do scenario-based training, typically when me or one of my team members went out, we would structure the training as such, looking at the risk assessment. That would typically be where we would start our process, understanding what they have in place. So in some areas, risk relatively low, we would pull things that we knew that the team wasn't necessarily strong on based on conversations that we have. I would work with like our EH&S team or the newness of the team in general. And the way we would structure each office, every group had a business continuity council, and that council consisted of a coordinator who was responsible for working with my team for actually leading these once we were done. So we were doing the trainer in every instance. Typically, the simulation is about a 4-hour discussion. And like in this case, what we would do is um, basically determine how they would respond in the event of an incident. And then we would identify their steps to recover. But mind you, we have plans in place within each of the facilities. So I also have to review those because while we're doing the identification of the steps, we're also evaluating them on how well the leadership team knows the steps. So let's use this one as an example. This uses day zero, 8:30 in the morning, and we find out there's a fire in our assembly area, and there's a couple of annealing ovens that are impacted by it. Basic process: we contact the fire department. Plant manager, who may not be there at the time to be traveling, is notified, and we would talk through this with the group to basically make sure that we were aware of, and I would quiz people basically to understand how comfortable they are with knowing who to contact, what the steps are to ensure employee safety. And if we find out we've got a really dominant person in the room, we typically would find a way to remove them from the scenario. And so that's where the continuity council is actually responding. They're actually giving us the steps that they would take.
Can we talk about why you would remove them from the scenario? Is it that they're overwhelming the conversation with their own ideas, or that you need to see how a team would work without its leader?
It's a combination of both. So when you think of, again, manufacturing, I'm using as an example today, but I'm also finding that in airlines as well. You have some people who have been there for 30 and 40 years. They know the operation inside and out. They are the brains behind the system. The thing is, they may not be there. And the only way that a lead team can actually work effectively is if there is an understanding of what your emergency evacuation processes are and that everyone's aware of them. And I've seen situations where we've been able to actually do our simulations, including plant engineers and people who are actually working on the manufacturing floor, where they were fully aware of what was happening, while I've seen others where the leadership team may have just been newly assembled, or they took a low view of what risks are within their facility and never actually put value into it. And so this is our time to start having that discussion so that we make sure that there's enough knowledge within the lead team to actually effectively manage the disaster.
Great.
So this is just looking at it. This is later in the same day, and we found out that they were able to get the fire down. We had both of the annealing ovens were actually damaged. There's some structural damage that needed to happen in the place. We had a couple of injuries, and I guess someone was actually close enough where they actually died. And so then we paused. One more time, we want to walk through what the steps they're taking because, again, employee safety is important. And when I talk about a situation where I'm aware of where we actually had a direct hit from a hurricane, I found out we had a plant full of people. And when I found that, I was like, oh my God, what do you mean? We knew about this before it happened. But here's a situation where you didn't know about it. It happened live, and you have to make sure that employee safety being first, that they're actually going through the right steps and that they're looking at the right parts of it because our continuity plans were built more around business resumption. They refer to where we look at our employee health and safety processes and making sure that the building is sound, everyone's safe, there's no water on the floors, and things of water is working properly, that we have fire extinguishing units within the building. It's just going through all of the day to day. This part of it really starts to give us that understanding that the lead team can actually manage the disaster. Now, this
I'm
part of
sorry,
it
I
now
skipped a
is to
slide.
look. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Glenn, I skipped a slide. We're now at 6 p.m. on the day of the fire.
Okay, and this takes in really what happens. I I currently work for Resolink, and what we do is we do event monitoring for supply chain. So I would see a lot of these types of alerts um, from our customers. Because actually, bad news does travel much faster than anything else. So in this situation, where what's embedded in a plan, a true business continuity plan, is your communication free. And this is actually being tested in every piece of this single day. So in the morning, there are notifications that should be going within to corporate. The afternoon, updates should be happening, going back to corporate. And then this time, you now are going to start dealing with the media. This information is now out there, and we are in a day and time where information travels so fast that we have to be able to um, develop our communication, because within the organization, the key piece is making sure that you can proactively communicate as much to your customers as possible. Because by now, you're going to start seeing a number of inquiries that are coming from multiple customers, whether they know you're doing work for them out of that particular facility or not. And that takes you right back into day one. So day one, your actual follow up day, you're now dealing with customers that you're constantly inquiring. You've got media outlets that are there. Now you're looking at the fact, well, hey, we're in a shared office. Didn't we? And these are things that we didn't consider early on. If we're in a multiple unit building, and maybe the customer next door actually had the explosion that directly impacted our facility. These are things that we should have gathered information on early on, and this allows them to now look at the risk assessment, because in the particular scenario that I'm using, we developed it on site because there were some things I saw once I physically got there, and we realized that we were dealing with high risk neighbors at the exact same time, and so the team realized that, okay, yeah, we didn't take in consideration where we placed some of our most critical machines at the time. And so this actually made us start reevaluating whether or not that particular location was suitable for what we needed. And then the last piece of it really comes down to communication and understanding what we're communicating within corporate, how we're structuring our information to the media, making sure that the right people are actually talking, which is key. Because again, it comes down to reputation of your organization and how well you deal with the crisis.
Great. And before we move on to the next topic, how do you give the team feedback on their performance as you take them through this exercise?
There are a couple of ways. Well, one, we're typically scribing the information, and again, I do train the trainer. I love teaching people to fish, and because during the disaster, since it was a global organization, a lot of times things happened when I slept. Um, that's one way we did it is we logged the gap, and we basically have I would either use spreadsheets typically because they're easy to create SharePoint libraries out of. Um, you could use Word or OneNote, whatever tool you decide to use. But we would typically look at, as we're going through each part of the scenario, identify the gap, and then start putting in corrective actions. And it's all logged while we're actually going through the actual assessment.
Great. So I want to ask you about how you structure a training when you come into each location.
Okay, well, it really depends on the location. So while some places were a lot more mature and we had teams that were established and maybe supported like the automotive industry where a lot of the requirements were really high, um, we would actually just stick to reviewing the plan, going through all of the critical business operation areas, walking through discussions with each of the leaders in those areas. So we would typically do a 2-day um, schedule. And that 2-day schedule is literally looking through the plan, making sure that it's current and updated, because we would establish that in our policy that you at least review the plan once a year. It's always suggested that while it's reviewed once a year, that you're actually going to look at it probably more than once because business requirements change, and you want to make sure that you are number of people that are working in those different areas or different business units may fluctuate a little bit, or you may add a new process within the organization. So it's making sure that the documents stay alive. The other parts that we do is while we're identifying we'll identify a scenario, we'll review the risk assessment, then identify a scenario, and then go through the scenario training. Midway through all of this, probably midway between day 2, I actually then hand over the ranks back to the coordinator. And then the coordinator actually starts to facilitate the latter parts of the meeting. And then me and the coordinator would work and identify ways they can help drive in, and I become more of a support structure for whoever that coordinator is. So my entire time is giving ownership to the local team so that they can actually own the overall process, making sure that everything stays live.
Great. And you mentioned this, touched on it slightly in the answer to the last question that, you need to keep these documents alive and train about once a year. But are there reasons why you might need to train more frequently or revisit your plan more frequently?
Yes, there are changes in how we support customers, process, team members changes. And that's one of the areas I struggled with most because again I was working within large organizations and you're dealing with 54, 70 different facilities. Turnover happens. Um, and that's again I start to advocate use of different technologies because it helps streamline a lot of things and create structure for the program. Notification tools were very important to us because at the time of a disaster, if you establish the right call trees using tool, I can communicate to 20 people within 5 minutes versus me calling one person to call someone else and sending out emails and waiting. And that was kind of how we would do a lot of the work there.
Great. And having done so many of these, what tips do you have for people who are, trying to structure their own trainings or, build their own programs?
Learn the program. That's the first one. Because I think that's the hardest piece. You put yourself in the middle of these programs and you become the life of it, right? You've got to have a lot of energy because you're working with people that are probably going to look at this and wonder how important this really is. So you're going to have to actually believe in what you're doing. That's why I started off talking about the importance of understanding business objectives, how you tie into it, um, how you're supporting the business objectives, understanding your stakeholders, because all of that, while it looks at just how you get buy-in from your executive, it's also how you get buy-in from the plant. And you also have to spend time listening to them to understand what their areas of weaknesses are.
Great. And I want to ask you even further about how to get executive buy-in. I think a lot of people who are in charge of emergency preparedness programs, really struggle with this. So, what could you offer them, as advice to help get the resources and the staff time that they need to create a good training program?
It has to tie directly to what your corporate objectives are. Each year, what I did is looked at our corporate objectives, and if I saw changes that didn't necessarily align with what we were doing, I would evaluate our program, making sure that we were tied to them. The other part is quantifying it. How much is it really worth to the organization? The project manager in me is always going to look at risk avoidance. While it's not necessarily the greatest option, you can also look at your other requirements. I had customer requirements. In the manufacturing world, you're looking at business continuity and risk management is actually becoming a standard for doing business. So now you're tying yourself to revenue generation. So now you've actually quantified that risk avoidance because it's tied to several multi-million-dollar contracts. Um, that's also going to help you develop what your cost benefit analysis is. And if you decide to structure training, you can possibly look at other ways that you can do it minus travel. Like in my case, I created online training that was interactive because it allowed me to push out the onboarding portion of it to get the basis of the team structured before we actually got out there. And that also then talks into how we add to the teams. And then the other piece is how do you get the technology to make you that much more proactive to understand potential impact faster.
Great. And I know that you came up with this benefits of training cycle, and I just want to give you the opportunity to walk us through it.
Yeah, well, and it goes back to everything that we're talking about. It ultimately, this is where you're going to get the buy-in at the plant or at the local level, because if they can reduce recovery time because they understand what the steps are to actually ensure safety, um, certify a given area, and get back up and running, that's important because again, their focus is how do we continue to support our customers. That's primarily what they're looking at. And then once you do that, it's documenting and creating those consolidation of all of your critical information. It's more than just creating binders. It's now validating it. Did I put in the right recovery steps? And from there, you've got customer requirements. If your customers are asking for, we were always asked, do you have business continuity plans? We could actually provide a customer view of, and it was actually a legitimate plan. It wasn't just a document that we printed and put on a folder on a shelf and say, hey, it's in a binder, and if the building's burning down, we'll have access to this information. And then from there, it's testing it, it's going through the simulation and discussion, and realizing this is a living document, it's a living process, and we're always looking at ways to improve it.
Great. So that brings us to the end of the questions that I wanted to ask you, but we are excited to take questions from anyone in the audience. If people have questions, you can type it right into the question box. Thanks, Glenn. I feel like I've already learned so much. So this was, and that we're just scratching the surface of your knowledge. So yeah, thank you. I so appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I'm going to give people a couple seconds to type in their questions. Okay, so we've got one here for tabletop exercises. What's the best way to get everyone talking?
That's where the being agile enough to remove people was very important. So like I used that particular scenario. I actually did have the most talkative person removed. That they took smoke inhalation, and I literally made it up while we were in the middle of the discussion. But finding creative ways to remove the most talkative person, and then making sure that it's a brainstorming session. And if the Six Sigma aspect of me is always going to look at how I start the discussion to make sure that it's a comfortable place that everyone speaks.
Great. And I feel like that must also add, a realistic element of surprise when you say like, nope, you've got smoke inhalation, you're out. It makes it feel more dynamic and like anything could happen, which is, much more like the real world.
Exactly.
Um, Another question, how complex should you make your training exercises? If you're trying to balance between testing your employees and making it too difficult.
Not too complex. You don't want to overwhelm them because in many cases they have their own jobs to still deal with, and so you got to understand the reality is that they may not fully be vested. I had a team in Italy where I literally dealt with that, and it was very difficult. But I also had an interpreter on top of it, but never too difficult. You again, it's one of those situations where you have to be agile enough during the session to see when people are checking out.
And how do you get them back in when they check out?
That's the hard part. It's yeah, it's bad.
Great. And I also see that we have a question about whether the recording of this webinar will be available and sent to the participants. The answer is definitely yes. We will be sending you an email. The process for getting the recording uploaded takes probably about 24 hours. So it won't be immediately, but it will definitely follow. And another one for you, Glenn. I know you also have to teach the fundamentals of emergency preparedness. How do you get people engaged in that, to prepare them to respond to a scenario?
Everything goes back to company objectives. Everything. It's just like any, and just so everyone knows that my background happens to be IT project management and Six Sigma. So whenever we develop projects or any type of a program, to me the most fundamental piece is how does it actually enable the business to do what it's there for. And if there's no tie to it and you can't sell it, it's very difficult. And that's why the most fundamental piece of it all is understanding what it is you actually do for your customers.
Great. And how do you use video for online training, if you use video at all?
Um, for one section, I actually gathered video from an actual event to bring it home to kind of show the impact of a disaster. Actually, I had some old videos from Harvey, um, videos from the hurricane that just went through Zhuhai, China last year. I actually used true video samples that I pulled, but I actually had some from our own employees. The other parts are just PowerPoint and using a recording of someone else who actually records for a living, using their voice to actually give the right inflections and everything needed for the training to keep people engaged.
Great. Um, and do you ever ask employees, for topics that they want to be trained on?
Absolutely. It's always looking at ways to get information from them. And even during our training, they're always open for we have breaks throughout the day. And then when I tell you we provide a very extensive hourly breakdown that's fairly fluid, but we do ask for feedback, and that happens to be one of the share points of the what I put together was a business continuity management system. that was one of the areas where we would share input from the different coordinators and other leaders within the facility. But the voice of the customer is extremely important.
And then to another question about the mix of training formats. What's the right mix? More tabletops because they're easier, or more live events because they're more engaging?
A combination of both. And it because it's just like when we were growing up. Where I come from, we did tornado drills, and it was going to the hallway and assuming a position to protect your head, or fire drills you go through within your facilities. Sometimes making them live are things that it actually brings it to life. Tabletops are easy, especially when you have multiple facilities and you have a limited number of resources that are actually doing them. Tabletops are just, we have to find the right mix.
Great. And I think that is a great segue into our next slide, introducing our what will be our next webinar. We are going to be talking on March 8th to Jay Bryant. He is a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, and he is an expert in active shooter preparedness. On the AlertFind team, we've actually had we've seen Jay's presentation, and I just can't describe to you all the ways in which it has changed the way that we prepare ourselves and view the world. And I am so excited for people to be able to learn from Jay about how to prepare your organization, for the potential that you would be attacked by an active shooter. He's an incredible expert and so thorough and clear about how to plan for really the unimaginable. So I hope that you all join us next time on March 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And now, Glenn, I just want to thank you so much for spending time with us today. This was incredible, and I think that we've all learned so much from you. So thanks so much for being here. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And just to remind you guys, AlertFind is an emergency notification system for business continuity professionals. And if you're interested in seeing it in action, one of our solution experts would love to speak with you about it. And you can schedule a demo through the button on this presentation when we send it out after, or through the forms on our site. And if you are interested in contacting Glenn, his contact information is here in the deck that we'll be sending out. And if you're interested in contacting AlertFind, you can find us online, or you can email me, daniellericci@aurea.com. Glenn, I know that I want to give you the chance to tell us a little bit about your company and what you do.
Okay, well, this is just an extension of what I saw and learned at the organization, and looking at how much risk is something we have to look at within our supply chain. I see a need in the industry, so I made the transition over to Resolink. We do provide supply chain resilience analytics and intelligence that helps accelerate understanding impact to your operations faster.
Beautiful. Thank you again, Glenn, and thanks everyone for attending, and hope to see you all on March 8th. Thank you so much.
Thank you.